Imagine you're in London in the year 1347. You feelin' well. A fever, chills, headaches, the usual. But then the swelling starts in your groin or underarm, a painful lump that grows larger each day. It's hard and cold to the touch, a sign of a disease no doctor has ever seen before. They call it the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. You know you're doomed. So let me tell you its chilling story. It started a long way from London, in Asia, where rats swarmed aboard ships sailing innocently into European harbors. No one knew they carried death, a kind of death so horrifying, so relentless that it would reduce cities to ghost towns, erase entire bloodlines, and change the course of human history. Those who fell ill suffered terribly. At first, there were flu-like symptoms, fever, chills, headaches, weakness. But soon things got much worse. The victim's body would begin to shut down. Blood poisoning set in. The victim's limbs turned black and gangrenous. They were dead within a few days. If they were lucky, they were buried in mass graves piled with hundreds of other bodies. But many rotted in their homes, their corpses untouched. Neighbors, family, even priests were too terrified to go near them. The plague didn't care about social standing. It indiscriminately targeted the rich, the poor, the devout, the wicked. Entire villages were wiped out, and Florence. It's estimated that 60% of the population died. Paris saw its share too. There, corpses floated in the Seine. And in London, the stench of death was so bad that people stuffed herbs up their noses just to walk the streets. No one understood what was happening. Some blamed the Jews. Others said it was God's punishment. Some thought the air itself had turned toxic. This miasma theory went so far that people wore masks filled with fragrant herbs, thinking they could filter out the bad air. But behind it all was something terrifyingly simple, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats. And as trade expanded across the Silk Road, so too did the rats. They hid in ships and carts, moving unnoticed from Asia to Europe. It is thought that the Mongol siege of the Genos trading port of Kaffa may have been the trigger point. Some say the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the walls, launching not just a siege, but a biological apocalypse. From there, it spread like wildfire. Doctors were helpless. The famed plague doctors with their beak masks became grim symbols of the era. Their costumes, filled with scented herbs, were meant to protect them, but were little more than superstition. Nothing worked. Prayers, bloodletting, isolation, nothing could stop the Black Death. Imagine walking through a medieval town at the height of the plague. Church bells constantly tolled. Funeral carts creaked by piled high with bodies. The cries of the dying echoed in every street. Children orphaned overnight wandered aimlessly. In some places, the social order completely broke down. Parents abandoned their children, husbands fled from wives, entire monasteries were emptied in days, and as the death toll mounted, so did the fear. But in the face of horror, people reacted in different ways. Some turned to flagellation, whipping themselves in the streets. They believed their suffering could atone for the sins of humanity. Others turned to pure hedonism, eating, drinking, and indulging in excess, convinced the world was ending. Estimates vary, but historians agree that between 75 to 200 million people died in just 4 short years. That was nearly half of Europe's population. Whole regions became depopulated. Farmlands were abandoned. Labor shortages caused economic upheaval. And with fewer mouths to feed, food prices dropped, but wages rose, changing the relationship between workers and lords forever. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was the beginning of the end of the feudal system. Art, too, began to reflect the darkness. Skeletons dancing with the living became common themes. The dance macabre, or dance of death, reminded people that death spares no one. Be they king or peasant, merchant or monk, all were equal before the plague. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of the Black Death is its psychological impact. The survivors were never the same. To live through such death was to be transformed. Trust in the church eroded since prayers had failed to stop the horror. Many questioned divine justice. A new age of skepticism began to creep into Europe's consciousness, quietly laying the foundations for the Renaissance and eventually the modern world. And yet, even as it faded, the plague never fully vanished. It returned in waves. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was just one example. Even today, the bacterium Yersinia pestis still exists in remote regions. But modern antibiotics can now cure what once wiped out half a continent. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a reckoning, a reminder of how fragile our world truly is, that the great cities we build, the societies we construct, can be torn apart in mere months by forces we don't understand. It's a story not only of suffering, but of survival, of how even in the darkest of times, humanity endures. The plague tested every belief system, every institution, every individual. And while millions perished, those who lived carried forward lessons written in blood. Lessons about fear, about resilience, and about the thin, trembling line between civilization and chaos. In the shadow of the Black Death, Europe would never be the same, neither would the world. So we humans, we like to think of ourselves as pretty special, right? Like, we're at the top of the food chain, conquerors of nature, and nothing can really stop us, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. But there's this one tiny microbe that kind of puts a damper on that narrative. You see, there are few diseases in human history that have haunted us quite like smallpox. For over 3,000 years, it existed like a shadow behind civilization unseen, unpredictable, and utterly merciless. It didn't need armies or politics. It didn't choose sides. Smallpox was a great equalizer and a silent executioner. And the craziest part, it still might be out there waiting for its next move. Smallpox first popped up in ancient Egypt, around 1500 BC. We know this because we can see it on preserved mummies. Deep, pitted marks etched into their skin like some kind of weird alien hieroglyphic. But here's the thing, smallpox wasn't picky about who it infected. It didn't care if you were a pharaoh, a peasant, a warrior, a poet, or a saint. It just saw you as a host and your body became a battleground for its survival. The first real devastation we know about happened during the Age of Exploration in the 16th century, when Europeans started exploring and conquering the Americas. They inadvertently unleashed smallpox on the indigenous peoples who had no immunity to it. Entire civilizations vanished like the Aztecs and the Inca. And yeah, that's thanks in part to diseases like smallpox, which were new to these populations and absolutely devastating. I mean, when the Spanish showed up in Mexico in 1520, a single infected African slave sparked an epidemic that killed over half the native population in just 1 year. Bodies piled up so fast that they couldn't be buried quickly enough. Everyone from warriors and priests to kings and farmers. Nobody was safe. And this wasn't a one-off event. This happened all over the Americas. And if you're wondering how bad things got, they were bad. Sometimes whole communities were wiped out. Some historians estimate that smallpox along with other European diseases brought to the Americas killed between 50 and 90% of the native populations. It's hard to overstate the impact on these societies. The Inca, for example, had an emperor die from smallpox and his two successors die too, within a generation. The empire was in ruins. But let me put it this way. If smallpox was a horror show in the Americas, in Europe, it was straight up hell. During the 18th century alone, it was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 400,000 Europeans each year. 1 out of every 3 people who caught it bit the big one. And those who lived were often left blind, sterile or with horrible scars. But amidst all this death and despair, a guy named Edward Jenner stepped in and was like, "Nope, I'm gonna call dibs on this deadly disease." See, Jenner was an English doctor who in 1796 tested the world's first vaccine on a young boy. His idea was that since milkmaids who caught the much milder cowpox seemed immune to smallpox, maybe we could use cowpox to protect people from smallpox. And guess what? It worked. Now, Jenner's method was kinda rudimentary and ethically questionable. I mean, he basically exposed a kid to a disease just to see what would happen. But hey, results. And that's what led to the world's first vaccination campaign. From that point on, Vaccination was the main weapon in our arsenal against smallpox. But to totally eradicate it, to completely wipe it off the planet, that was gonna take a lot longer. It wasn't until 1967 that the World Health Organization launched the Global Eradication Campaign. But by the late 1970s, the effort was so close to success that they could almost taste it. And on October 2, 1979, the last case of naturally occurring smallpox was recorded in Somalia. 2 years later, the World Health Assembly officially declared smallpox eradicated. Today, there are only 2 known samples of the virus left in the world, one in Russia and one in the United States. These samples are kept in high-security labs, and we can't access them. There are strict rules and regulations in place to ensure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. And let me tell you why that's important. You see, there's always been the fear that smallpox could be used as a biological weapon. I mean, we've seen how devastating it was naturally. But intentionally unleashing it on a population would be, well, it's terrifying to even think about. So here's the deal. Smallpox may be gone. But the threat of it isn't. There's still that tiny chance, however remote, that the virus could escape, mutate, or be weaponized. And that's why scientists continue to study it. They want to understand it better, develop new treatments, and make sure that if it does reemerge, they're ready. And that brings us back to where we started. We humans love to think of ourselves as being on top of the world, but the truth is we're not invincible. Smallpox taught us that lesson, and it's one we can't afford to forget. Smallpox reminds us that even the smallest microbe can bring humanity to its knees, and that we can't ever let our guard down. But it also reminds us of what we're capable of when we work together, because in the end, it was our curiosity, our determination, and our refusal to give up that led to the eradication of smallpox. It was a long and hard battle, but it was a battle worth fighting. There are few diseases in human history that have haunted us quite like smallpox. For over 3,000 years, it existed like a shadow behind civilization and seen, unpredictable, and utterly merciless. It didn't need armies or politics. It didn't choose sides. Smallpox was a great equalizer and a silent executioner. By the time it was finally eradicated in 1980, it had killed an estimated 300 to 500 million people. That's more than the deaths caused by all the wars of the 20th century combined. But those are just numbers cold, distant, to understand the true terror of smallpox. You have to look into the faces it destroyed, and the worlds it left broken. The first evidence of smallpox dates back to ancient Egypt. Mummies from 1500 BC bear its scars deep, pitted marks etched into their preserved flesh like warnings from the past. As empires rose and fell, smallpox moved with them, quietly embedding itself into every corner of human life. But it wasn't until the age of exploration that the disease would show its most monstrous face. In the 16th century, when European explorers arrived in the Americas, they didn't just bring steel and gunpowder, they brought smallpox. And for the indigenous peoples of the New World, who had no immunity, it was nothing less than apocalyptic. Entire civilizations vanished. The Aztec Empire was reduced to ashes not just by swords, but by a virus they had never seen before. In 1520, a single infected African slave brought by the Spanish ignited an epidemic in Mexico that killed over half the native population in just 1 year. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Warriors, priests, kings, farmers, none were spared. The Inca Empire suffered a similar fate. Before Spanish conquistadors even reached their heartland, smallpox had already decimated it. Their emperor died of it. His successor died. And what was left was a fractured, mourning people who could not withstand the foreign invasion that followed. Smallpox didn't just kill, it unraveled. Even in Europe, where the disease was endemic, it was deeply feared. In the 18th century alone, it was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 400,000 Europeans each year. 1 out of every 3 people who caught it would die. And those who survived, they were often left blind, sterile, or horribly disfigured. Survivors carried lifelong scars not just on their bodies, but in their memories. It spared no one. Kings died from it, queens, saints, poets, emperors. In Russia, Tsar Peter II, In France, King Louis XV. In England, Queen Mary II. The disease was so widespread that parents would expose their children intentionally, hoping they would survive and be immune. And then came a man named Edward Jenner. In 1796, Jenner made a curious observation. Milkmaids, who were often exposed to cowpox, a much milder disease, seemed immune to smallpox. He decided to test a radical idea: infect a child with cowpox, then expose him to smallpox. The child didn't get sick. It was crude. It was ethically dubious. But it worked. Jenner's experiment marked the birth of vaccination, a word derived from vacca, the Latin word for cow. This would become the cornerstone of the fight against smallpox, and eventually, the most powerful weapon ever wielded against a disease. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, vaccination campaigns began to spread. The disease persisted, but the world was changing. And in 1967, the World Health Organization launched the most ambitious health campaign in human history: the global eradication of smallpox. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers went into jungles, deserts, war zones, anywhere the virus might hide. It wasn't easy, but slowly, village by village, continent by continent, the disease was cornered, tracked, contained, and finally stopped. In 1977, Ali Mayo Malan, a hospital cook in Somalia, became the last person in the world to contract naturally occurring smallpox. He survived, and with that, after thousands of years of terror, the nightmare ended. In 1980, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox officially eradicated. It remains the only human disease ever completely wiped from the planet. Today, only 2 known samples of the virus remain, one in Russia and one in the United States, locked away in high-security labs. Their existence continues to spark fierce ethical debate. Some argue they must be destroyed forever. Others say they must be studied in case the unthinkable happens and smallpox returns through accident, or worse, through bioterrorism. But the story of smallpox is not just a cautionary tale of horror. It's a story of human resilience, of science over superstition, of collaboration across borders, ideologies, and languages. It's a reminder that even our darkest enemies, those invisible and ancient, can be defeated. And yet, it is also a warning that diseases don't disappear simply because we no longer fear them. The victory over smallpox was hard-won. It took centuries, millions of lives, and the determined effort of people who refuse to surrender, because the moment we forget what smallpox did to us is the moment we risk letting history repeat itself. It began in 1918, not with a bang, but a cough. A soldier in Kansas complained of a sore throat. Nothing unusual. After all, the world was in the final throes of World War I. The trenches of Europe were filled with worse gas attacks, starvation, rats, despair. But what that soldier carried was something far more lethal than bullets or bombs. It was the beginning of what would become one of the deadliest pandemics in human history: the Spanish flu. They called it Spanish not because it started in Spain, but because Spain, being neutral in the war, didn't censor the press, while other countries hid the truth behind their wartime silence. Spanish newspapers reported openly on the devastation, so the world gave the virus a name it didn't deserve: Spanish flu, a name that masked its true origins and its terrifying reach. In just over a year, this virus would infect an estimated 500 million people, nearly 1/3 of the world's population at the time, and it would kill between 50 to 100 million. Let that number sink in. That's more than the total number of deaths in both world wars combined. What made this flu different, what made it so monstrous, was not just its speed or the sheer scale of its destruction. It was who it killed. Ordinary flu tends to take the old, the weak, the very young, but this was a butcher of the strong. It targeted healthy young adults, the very people who were supposed to survive: soldiers, nurses, teachers, factory workers. Their immune systems overreacted, triggering what's called a cytokine storm, a deadly internal meltdown where the body begins to destroy itself. They would get sick in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Some victims turned blue from lack of oxygen, their lungs filled with fluid, blood oozed from their noses, ears, eyes. In many cases, It wasn't even the virus itself that killed, it was the pneumonia that followed, destroying lungs already weakened by the initial infection, and this was happening everywhere. In India, more than 12 million people died, some estimates say as high as 20 million. In Iran, corpses piled up in mosques, waiting for burial. In Alaska, entire Inuit villages were wiped off the map. In Philadelphia, within 72 hours of the first reported case, thousands were dead. Hospitals were so overwhelmed that school auditoriums were turned into makeshift morgues. Bodies were buried in mass graves, hastily dug by bulldozers. And yet, the world said little. Why? Because the war came first. Governments didn't want to harm morale. They didn't want to admit that something invisible was killing more soldiers than the battlefield ever could, and so people were told to carry on, go to work, go to parades, go to war. It was in these crowded gatherings that the virus thrived. In October 1918, Philadelphia held a war bond parade with more than 200,000 attendees despite warnings. Within days, the hospitals were flooded. The city became a chamber of death. It's hard to describe what it meant to live through those days. You would see a man walking down the street, and then watch him collapse. Streetcars ran with dead bodies slumped in their seats. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. Children became orphans overnight. People stopped helping each other, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer terror. And yet, unlike COVID-19, which came with science and information, the Spanish flu struck in an era of medical ignorance. There were no antivirals, no ventilators, no understanding of viruses. The microscope couldn't even see the pathogen causing the deaths. Doctors blamed dust, bad air. One doctor insisted it came from German submarines releasing poison gas into American cities. Superstition spread like the disease itself. People wore gauze masks, but they did little. Some drank whiskey, others chewed garlic or rubbed kerosene on their chests. In the absence of facts, fear ruled. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the flu disappeared. By the summer of 1919, it had burned through its fuel through the human lives it needed to sustain itself. Those who were still alive emerged from their homes into a world utterly changed. But there were no monuments, no global days of mourning, no speeches, because the world was too busy celebrating the end of World War I. It chose to forget. History buried the Spanish flu in silence, in footnotes, in dust-covered archives. For decades, it was a forgotten horror, whispered about but rarely studied. It was only later, much later, that scientists and historians began to realize what had truly happened. That the most devastating event of the 20th century was not fought in trenches or on beaches, but in bedrooms, hospitals, and quiet homes across every continent. The Spanish flu was a ghost that passed through humanity, a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not always visible, and that the world can end, not with a bomb, but with a breath. It taught us about the fragility of modern life, about how thin the line is between order and chaos, about how silence, denial, and delay can be just as deadly as any virus. And perhaps most chilling of all, it taught us that it can happen again.